Dev came back the next morning.
Deserve better than this.
Maya wasn't surprised.
Stand down,
She'd spent
soldier.
the entire
That's an
previous
order.
evening replaying their encounter, analyzing it like she was debriefing a failed mission. She'd recognized him the moment he said her call sign, but his recognition had felt different. It had felt like a door opening that she'd spent 3 years trying to lock. He sat at the corner table, the one with the view of the water, and ordered the same Costa Rican roast. This time he stayed. "How long?" he asked when she brought the coffee, and she understood immediately that he wasn't asking about her employment at the cafe. 3 years next month, she said, sliding into the seat across from him because there was no pretense left to maintain. Operation Cedar Ridge. You? Still flying, his hands wrapped around the cup like he was trying to absorb its heat. But it's different now. Everything's different. They didn't talk about Chen that morning. They talked around him. Small questions that circled the real damage like satellites orbiting a black hole. Where had she been stationed? What was she flying before? Did she remember the briefing in Islamabad where the projector malfunctioned for 40 minutes? She remembered everything. By the third morning, Dev arrived before the cafe officially opened. Maya was still counting inventory, and she let him in through the side door without comment. They sat in the pre-dawn darkness with only the espresso machine's pilot light for illumination, and something about the darkness made honesty possible. "I was supposed to provide air support," Dev said. His voice sounded different in the quiet, younger somehow, or maybe just less defended. "But my flight path was compromised by the storm system. I couldn't reach your position in time. When I finally broke through the weather, your helicopter was already down." Maya had read the report 17 times. She knew every word. But hearing it from him made it real in a way documentation never could. The wind shear was impossible to predict. The equipment failure was my responsibility to catch before we launched. I signed off on the pre-flight. I missed something. "So did I." Maya's voice was steady, but her hands were not. She tucked them under the table. "My instruments showed everything normal. Either they were wrong, or I wasn't reading them correctly. Either way, Chen paid the price." This was the thing no one ever said in official contexts, that Sergeant James Chen, 23 years old with a fiancée waiting in San Diego, had drowned in 2 feet of water because a helicopter had gone down, and the current had been too strong, and rescue had taken too long. That he'd called Maya's name right before the water took him. That some mistakes didn't get written off as acceptable losses in reports. They just lived inside your chest like unexploded ordnance. Deb's eyes were wet. Maya's realized hers were too. "I couldn't save him," Dev said. "I've replayed that mission 200 times, 1,000 times. I changed the variables, changed my decisions, changed the wind, and every time, Chen still dies." "Because that's what happened," Maya said quietly. "Not because of what we did or didn't do, because sometimes people die and there's no reason that makes sense and no decision we could have changed that would have fixed it." She learned this in therapy, a therapist paid for by the military, which meant she had initially distrusted everything the woman said. But after 6 months, something had shifted. The therapist had helped her understand that survivor's guilt wasn't something to overcome. It was something to integrate, to carry, to let become part of who she was, without letting it define everything she could be. "How did you get here?" Dev asked. "To this." He gestured at the cafe, the morning, the simple act of them sitting together. "I couldn't fly anymore," Maya said. "Not for months after. Every time I'd get into a cockpit, I'd see Chen's face. My hands would shake. My commanding officer suggested a transfer, which was military speak for "you're a liability." So I took extended leave, and the leave became a resignation, and then I needed income, and this job was available. And she trailed off. "I'm still figuring out how to exist in a world where I'm not that person anymore." "You're still that person," Dev said, and something in his tone made her look up. "I watched your flying from a distance for 5 years before Cedar Ridge. You were the best pilot in your wing, not because you were fearless, because you were careful, because you understood that courage wasn't about being unafraid, it was about being terrified and doing it anyway." Maya felt something shift in her chest. No one had talked about her flying since she left. Not her family, not her friends, not even her therapist.
It was like that entire career had been painted over, replaced with the narrative of someone who had broken and unable to piece herself back together. You were at the Dubai Strategy Conference. 2 years before Cedar Ridge, you presented the tactical response framework. His expression changed, surprise, then something that looked like relief. I remember you asking the question about civilian casualties in secondary strike zones. No one else seemed to care about the answer. You did. They sat with that for a moment, understanding dawning between them like a sunrise neither of them had planned to witness. They'd been watching each other. Not consciously, not intentionally, but they'd been aware of each other moving through the same professional space, had noticed the work the other did, and cared about it in ways that transcended the casual observation of colleagues. "Why did you come back this morning?" Dev asked. He took a long time answering. "Because for 3 years, I've carried around this ghost of a mission that went wrong. And then yesterday, I discovered the ghost had a face and a name, and she was working in a coffee shop at the marina. And I realized that maybe I didn't have to carry it alone anymore." It wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't even a promise. But it was an acknowledgement of something that had been growing in both of them since the moment he said her call sign, and she looked up. Maya reached across the table and took his hand. His palm was warm from the coffee cup, and his grip was careful, testing whether she wanted this, giving her the space to pull away. She didn't pull away. "We need to talk about what comes next, because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone from that world. I'm still too broken. I'm still flying, which means I'm still broken in different ways. But maybe broken people can recognize each other without trying to fix what's already fractured. Maybe we can just," he paused, searching for words, "exist in the broken spaces together?" It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the kind of declaration that sounded good in stories, but it was honest in a way that mattered more than poetry. They spent that entire day together. Dev called in and took emergency leave from his base. They walked along the marina, watching the boats come in, and talked about the things that mattered. Not just the trauma, but the small details. His obsession with aviation history, her love of classical music, the way they both preferred silence to small talk, the fact that they both had recurring nightmares, but rarely discussed them with anyone. By the evening, when Dev walked Maya home to her small apartment above a bookstore, something fundamental had shifted between them. It wasn't quite love yet. It was something more foundational, recognition, the sense of being known by someone who understood not just your words, but the damage underneath them. At her door, Dev kissed her. It was gentle and careful, the kind of kiss that understood that trust had to be earned through moments that honored vulnerability. When he pulled away, Maya realized she was trembling. "This could break us," she said. "The past, the work, everything we're trying to leave behind." "Probably," Dev agreed, "but staying separate didn't work either. We just carried it alone." Maya kissed him again, and the fog rolled in from the marina, wrapping around them like a blessing neither of them had asked for, but both desperately needed.
The deployment notice arrived on a Tuesday in a sealed envelope marked with the official seal of the Defense Department. Maya stared at it for 20 minutes before opening it, which was time enough to understand that her brief escape was over. Humanitarian Rescue Operation, Conflict Zone, 2-month deployment, report to base within 48 hours. She called Dev before she called anyone else. "I got mine too," he said, his voice carrying that particular cadence that meant he'd been staring at official paperwork for longer than was healthy. Same operation, same timeline. They met at the Marina Cafe during the closing hour, when Maya was meant to be cleaning but instead found herself incapable of movement. Dev arrived with 2 coffees from a different shop, a small gesture that said he understood she couldn't be at work and have her life simultaneously dismantled. "This could have been chance," Deb said, settling across from her. "Operational needs, available personnel, geographic proximity, random assignment algorithms." "But it's not," Maya finished, "because I checked the roster. They specifically requested us, both of us. Someone at command level knows we worked together on Cedar Ridge." The conflict zone was unnamed in her briefing, though the geographical markers made it clear.
Middle East, coastal region, known militant activity. They'd be coordinating rescue operations for displaced civilians caught in what was diplomatically termed regional instability, but which really meant people with guns and fewer resources were fighting over territory that had been disputed for centuries. "I can't do this," Maya said, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "I can't go back there, not to that region, not after—" "You don't have a choice," Dev said. And his tone wasn't cruel, it was just factual. "Neither do I. The military doesn't pause our personal recovery schedules, it just reassigns them." Maya knew this. She'd known it the moment she opened the envelope. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different provinces entirely. "What if it happens again?" she asked. "What if we're on the same operation and something goes wrong and one of us—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The possibility was too large to vocalize. "Then we'll have to trust each other," Dev said, "and trust the training we both did before we broke, and accept that sometimes there are no guarantees except that we're going in knowing we're not alone." They had 36 hours. Maya used them to pack and also to understand, in a way she hadn't before, what it meant to love someone who lived in a world of precarious endings. They didn't spend those hours in romantic moments. Instead, they did something harder. They prepared. Dev took her through updated threat briefings. Maya walked him through the latest helicopter specifications and failure points. They reviewed contingency protocols and discussed what-ifs until their voices grew hoarse and their eyes burned from exhaustion. On the final night, they lay in Maya's small apartment bed, and Dev held her the way you hold something precious that might break. "If something happens," Dev said in the dark, "I need you to know that these 3 weeks, reconnecting with you, being allowed to exist in the same space without pretending we carry the same damage, it's changed something fundamental in me. It's reminded me that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about integrating the pain into something that has meaning." "That's the sort of thing that sounds beautiful until you're standing over a body," Maya said quietly. "True," Dev acknowledged, "but it's still true. Both things can be true simultaneously, that this matters and that we might still fail, that I love you and that love doesn't make us invincible." Maya rolled to face him in the darkness. "You love me? I've been in love with you since that conference in Dubai, when you asked about civilian casualties like you actually cared about the answer. I've loved you through Cedar Ridge and through 3 years of pretending I didn't. I'm in love with the version of you sitting here in the dark with me. I'll be in love with whatever version of you comes back from this deployment, if you come back." "When I come back," Maya corrected, but it was automatic. They both knew that nothing was certain. She kissed him instead of responding, and they made love with the kind of desperate care that came from people understanding they were borrowing time from an uncertain future. The next morning, they reported to base separately. Protocol demanded it. They would coordinate operations but maintain formal distance. Their personal relationship couldn't be documented in official channels because it would compromise command structure and decision-making authority. Maya understood the wisdom in this. It didn't make it any less agonizing. The briefing room was familiar in the way that trauma sites always are. She'd been in dozens of similar rooms, had sat through hundreds of similar briefings. But this time, when she saw Dev's name on the roster and noticed the way he didn't look at her, she understood that something had fundamentally changed. They were back in the military now. And the military, despite all its protocols for emotional management, had a way of consuming everything personal and reforging it into tactical considerations. The operation itself was scheduled for 72 hours after deployment. They'd have time to acclimate to the climate, to coordinate with local allies, to run through contingency scenarios that all ended with either success or tragedy, and nothing in between. Maya packed her gear with mechanical precision, muscle memory moving her hands while her mind traced through worst-case scenarios. In the barracks, she saw Dev twice, once during a coordination meeting where he briefed the team on air support patterns, once in the mess hall where they sat at opposite tables and didn't acknowledge each other. That night, she found a note in her equipment locker. It was written on military-issue paper in Dev's precise handwriting. "I love you. Come back to me. D." She kept it tucked against her heart, feeling the edges of the paper against her skin, a small anchor to something real in a world that was about to become very, very dangerous. The operation was meant to begin in 48 hours, but intel suggested the timeline was accelerating. Militants were moving toward the civilian encampment faster than predicted, which meant they were deploying early, which meant no final words, no last moments to prepare, which meant the life Maya had just begun rebuilding was about to detonate in ways she couldn't control. She understood, watching the frantically organized chaos of early deployment, that this was the cost of loving someone in a world defined by crisis. Sometimes you didn't get to say goodbye. Sometimes you just had to trust that the love you'd declared in the dark would survive whatever came next. At 5 in the morning, Maya did a final check of her helicopter. The maintenance crew had worked through the night, ensuring every system was optimal. She ran her hands over the fuselage like a prayer, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something approaching peace. She knew how to do this. She'd always known how to do this. The question was whether she could do it while carrying love in her chest like a second heartbeat, and whether that made her stronger or just another liability waiting to fail. The rotors began to turn. Around her, other helicopters were firing up their engines. In the tower, she could see Dev beginning his pre-flight sequence, preparing the tactical support aircraft. Maya whispered Dev's name like an invocation, like something that might protect them both, and lifted her helicopter into the dawn sky. Behind her, the base fell away. Ahead, the conflict zone waited like something alive and hungry. And inside her chest, love and terror and duty wove together into something that felt dangerously close to purpose.
The civilian encampment was worse than the briefings had suggested. Maya descended through smoke that wasn't from authorized sources, her instruments reading air quality levels that made her throat close even through the filtered oxygen mask. Below, the settlement sprawled across a valley floor, like something that had been hastily assembled and was already falling apart. Tents, makeshift shelters, roughly constructed medical stations. Approximately 3,000 people who needed evacuation in the next 6 hours before the militant advance made the zone completely inaccessible. "Ghost Dancer, this is tactical support," Dev's voice crackled through her headset, and hearing his call sign instead of his name made the moment feel both more professional and more intimate. "I have visual on your position, proceeding to coordinate with ground team. Maintain altitude at 250 feet. "Copy that, tactical support," Maya responded, and the formal language felt like armor. They were soldiers first, lovers second, professionals existing in a space where one mistake meant people died. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, was running through the evacuation protocols. They'd been briefed on the operation, but briefings never captured the weight of actual crisis. Morrison's hands shook slightly as he marked coordinates on the digital map. "First group is assembling at Checkpoint Alpha," Morrison said. "Approximately 40 people, mostly children and elderly. Next transport will be in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Maya had done faster evacuations, but not in hostile territory with unstable air conditions. The wind kept shifting, pushing her helicopter toward the ridgeline. She compensated with small adjustments, the kind of micro-corrections that looked invisible but required complete concentration. The first group emerged from the smoke like ghosts, moving slowly because speed was a luxury they didn't have. Maya counted automatically. 38 people, 2 fewer than promised, which meant someone was still being retrieved. "We have stragglers," Ground Coordinator Sarah Chen reported. No relation to the Chen from Cedar Ridge, but Maya's chest still tightened at the name. "Medical situation. Child with severe dehydration. We're bringing her up now." Maya held her position, feeling the wind try to push her sideways. Her instruments told her she had 18 minutes before fuel consumption made departure mandatory. She held position anyway. The first group came up with a medic, a woman in her 60s whose face was carved with the kind of worry that transcended language. Maya watched her secure the child into a transport harness, watched Sarah Chen do a final head count. 39 aboard, Sarah confirmed. You're clear for departure. Maya pulled up, and the helicopter responded like a living thing, tilting away from danger. Around her, 2 other evacuation helicopters were doing the same, a coordinated dance that looked chaotic to anyone not trained to see its patterns. We're en route back to base. First load delivered in 8 minutes. Copy, Ghost Dancer, Dev's voice came through. Maintain course. Hostile fire reported 3 miles northeast, avoiding that sector. The next 4 hours were a blur of landings and takeoffs, of loading desperate people into aircraft designed for war and repurposing them for mercy. Maya ran on adrenaline and muscle memory, her hands moving through practiced sequences while her mind stayed hyper-focused on wind patterns, fuel consumption, mechanical integrity. Dev's voice became her anchor. Every 5 minutes his updates came through. Wind shear developing at bearing 270. Hostile movement northeast, maintaining distance. You're clear for approach, Ghost Dancer. On her 4th evacuation run, Morrison spotted the problem before Maya did. Fuel line is showing inconsistency, he said, and his voice had shifted into the careful calm of someone reporting catastrophe. Pressure's dropping below safe parameters. We need to make this run and get back for maintenance, or we ground the aircraft. Maya processed this information with the part of her brain that had been trained to handle crisis. They had 240 people still waiting for evacuation, 2 other helicopters, both running their own schedules, and a fuel line that was slowly degrading. We continue, she decided. 1 more load, maximum capacity, then we're down for repairs. That's pushing parameters, Morrison said, but he was already running the calculations, confirming that it was technically possible if everything went perfectly. Everything never went perfectly. They loaded 207 people on the final run, packed the helicopter to capacity with families clinging to each other, and medics moving between them checking for critical vitals. Maya lifted off slowly, feeling the weight, feeling the aircraft strain under the load. The wind was worse on this run. Something in the weather patterns had shifted, and the valley was creating updrafts that pushed the helicopter like an invisible hand. Maya compensated, adjusted, compensated again. You're looking heavy, Dev said, and she could hear the tension in his voice now. How are you managing? Fuel line is compromised, she reported, keeping her voice level. This is the last load. After this, we're down for maintenance. She didn't hear his response immediately. When he spoke again, his voice had that particular quality that came from someone making difficult decisions in real time. Copy. I'm moving into intercept position. If you lose power, I'll have visual. That's not protocol, Maya said automatically. Tactical support aircraft are supposed to maintain distance to coordinate broader operations. I know, doing it anyway, Dev said. Maya wanted to argue. Protocol existed for reasons, but she also understood that Dev was saying something deeper, that he was choosing her safety over procedure, choosing to be close enough to help if the impossible happened. She flew on. The fuel line was definitely failing now, a slow degradation that she could feel in the way the aircraft was handling. They were 15 minutes from base. She had approximately 20 minutes of fuel remaining. The math was close, but workable. Then the engine stuttered. It was subtle, a moment of hesitation in the mechanical rhythm she'd been flying in for the past 4 hours, but it was enough to tell her that the fuel line compromise had become critical. The engine degradation is increasing, Morrison reported, his voice tight. Power output dropping. Estimate 10 minutes before we're in red zone. They were still 8 minutes from base. Ghost Dancer, report status, Dev's voice came through, and Maya realized he'd been monitoring her fuel consumption patterns the entire time. Engine degradation, Maya said calmly. Estimated 8 minutes to base. Fuel situation is marginal. I'm moving into intercept position. If you lose power, I'll have visual.
That's not protocol, Maya said automatically. Tactical support aircraft are supposed to maintain distance to coordinate broader operations. I know, doing it anyway, Dev said. Maya wanted to argue. Protocol existed for reasons, but she also understood that Dev was saying something deeper, that he was choosing her safety over procedure, choosing to be close enough to help if the impossible happened. She flew on. The fuel line was definitely failing now, a slow degradation that she could feel in the way the aircraft was handling. They were 15 minutes from base. She had approximately 20 minutes of fuel remaining. The math was close but workable. Then the engine stuttered. It was subtle, a moment of hesitation in the mechanical rhythm she'd been flying in for the past 4 hours, but it was enough to tell her that the fuel line compromise had become critical. The engine degradation is increasing, Morrison reported, his voice tight. Power output dropping. Estimate 10 minutes before we're in red zone. They were still 8 minutes from base. Ghost Dancer, report status, Dev's voice came through, and Maya realized he'd been monitoring her fuel consumption patterns the entire time. Engine degradation, Maya said calmly. Estimated 8 minutes to base. Fuel situation is marginal. I'm moving into intercept position. If you lose power, I'll have visual. That's not protocol, Maya said automatically. Tactical support aircraft are supposed to maintain distance to coordinate broader operations. I know, doing it anyway, Dev said. Maya wanted to argue. Protocol existed for reasons, but she also understood that Dev was saying something deeper, that he was choosing her safety over procedure, choosing to be close enough to help if the impossible happened. She flew on. The fuel line was definitely failing now, a slow degradation that she could feel in the way the aircraft was handling. They were 15 minutes from base. She had approximately 20 minutes of fuel remaining. The math was close but workable. Then the engine stuttered. It was subtle, a moment of hesitation in the mechanical rhythm she'd been flying in for the past 4 hours, but it was enough to tell her that the fuel line compromise had become critical. The engine degradation is increasing, Morrison reported, his voice tight. Power output dropping. Estimate 10 minutes before we're in red zone. They were still 8 minutes from base. Ghost Dancer, report status, Dev's voice came through, and Maya realized he'd been monitoring her fuel consumption patterns the entire time. Engine degradation, Maya said calmly. Estimated 8 minutes to base. Fuel situation is marginal. I'm moving into intercept position. If you lose power, I'll have visual. That's not protocol, Maya said automatically. Tactical support aircraft are supposed to maintain distance to coordinate broader operations. I know, doing it anyway, Dev said. Maya wanted to argue. Protocol existed for reasons, but she also understood that Dev was saying something deeper, that he was choosing her safety over procedure, choosing to be close enough to help if the impossible happened. She flew on. The fuel line was definitely failing now, a slow degradation that she could feel in the way the aircraft was handling. They were 50.
The Marina Cafe opened at 5 in the morning, when most people were still pretending sleep was possible. Maya Winters tied her apron with the kind of precision she'd learned in the military. Every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. The coffee maker hissed like a familiar friend as she set up for the early shift, pouring dark roast into the industrial brewer while the world outside remained shrouded in November fog. She'd chosen this place specifically because it was quiet. The marina meant water, meant movement, meant the kind of gentle chaos that distracted her mind from the kind that woke her at 3 in the morning. She could watch the fishing boats return with their daily catches, could lose herself in small conversations with regulars, could exist in a liminal space between her old life and whatever this new one was supposed to be. 3 years since the incident. 3 years since Operation Cedar Ridge, since that final mission that had gone sideways in ways no amount of investigation could fully explain. The report said pilot error. The report hadn't mentioned the impossible wind conditions or the equipment malfunction that no one wanted to acknowledge. The report certainly hadn't mentioned Sergeant James Chen, who'd been secured in her helicopter when everything fell apart. Maya pushed the thought away the way she'd learned to do. Quick, efficient, like closing a hatch.
The first customers were always the fishermen, gruff men in weathered coats who wanted their coffee black and their conversation minimal. Maya could work with that. She made 7 identical cups, each one exactly the same, and watched them drift in with the kind of tired satisfaction that came from honest work. There was something cleaner about their exhaustion, physical, earned, understandable. The morning ticked forward. 6:15, 6:30. She was wiping down the espresso machine when the door chimed. Something about the way he moved caught her attention first, deliberate but contained, like someone used to taking up less space than his presence naturally demanded. He was tall, with the kind of careful posture that came from military bearing rather than good parenting. His dark coat was expensive but worn at the edges, and his eyes had that particular shade of gray that only happened to people who'd spent considerable time looking at horizons. Maya had learned to notice these things, learned to recognize her own kind without obvious markers. "Black coffee," he said, and his voice carried the faint rasp of someone who'd been smoking or shouting recently, maybe both. "Whatever you'd recommend." She poured from the fresh batch she'd made 5 minutes ago, a small batch roast from a fair trade supplier in Costa Rica that was probably too good for someone who said, "Whatever you'd recommend." But something about him suggested he'd noticed the difference. As she turned to hand him the cup, she caught sight of the name tag on her own apron. There it was, the letters she'd requested specifically. G. Dancer, her call sign from before, back when she flew things with rotors and carried people who needed saving. His hands went still around the coffee cup. "Ghost Dancer?" His voice had changed, dropped half an octave, become something raw underneath the careful control. Maya looked up. She knew that face. She'd seen it in surveillance footage and mission briefings, had heard his name spoken in contexts that mattered. Lieutenant Commander Dev Ashford, senior pilot, advanced tactical operations, 7 commendations and a promotion he'd turned down twice. She knew him the way you know someone you've never met but thought about anyway, in that dangerous space between admiration and obsession. She also knew from the expression currently remaking his face that he recognized her. "Just Maya here," she said quietly. "Ghost Dancer was a long time ago." But the fog outside seemed to thicken, and the small cafe suddenly felt like it had no exits at all.
6 weeks after they returned from the deployment, Maya and Dev sat on a balcony overlooking the marina, watching the sunset dissolve from orange into purple. The cafe was still there below them, the one where it had started, where a cup of coffee and a recognized call sign had split their lives into before and after. The official debriefing was complete. Medals had been distributed, commendations written and filed. The media had briefly celebrated their operation as a humanitarian success. 3,000 civilians evacuated with 0 casualties among the rescue personnel. On paper, it was perfect. Neither of them felt perfect. Maya had started therapy again, a different therapist this time, one who specialized in post-deployment trauma and the particular complications that arose when you loved someone who'd been in the crisis with you. The nightmares were less frequent now, but they were more vivid. She'd dream of the helicopter losing power and this time not recovering. She'd dream of Dev's aircraft being shot down. She'd dream of the moment she realized she had too much to lose and couldn't protect any of it. Dev had requested a desk position. It had shocked everyone. He was being groomed for command, had been on track for admiral status. But he'd walked into his commanding officer's office and said he needed to ground himself for 6 months, needed to rebuild something internal that the deployment had fractured. "They asked if it was because of you," Dev said now, watching the light change across the water. Command was concerned about operational integrity, about whether personal relationships were compromising professional judgment. "And what did you tell them?" Maya asked. "I told them the truth, that yes, I was grounding myself because of you, but not because love makes you weak, because it makes you finally understand what you're fighting to protect." He turned to look at her.
I've spent 7 years in the military making decisions about other people's lives, and I was good at it because I maintained emotional distance. But that distance meant I wasn't actually connecting to the weight of those decisions. With you, I can't maintain that distance. Every decision matters because you matter. Maya listened to this and understood that Dev was describing something that looked like vulnerability, but was actually a different kind of strength. It was the courage to care about something enough to let it change you. I resigned from the military, Maya said quietly. It became official yesterday. Dev was quiet for a long moment. Talk to me about that. I can't do it anymore, Maya said. Not because of the trauma, though that's part of it, but because every time I get into a helicopter, I think about you, and I realize that my operational safety is compromised by the fact that you matter more to me than the mission. And in a military context, that's unacceptable. People die when you're distracted. People died when I was distracted before. So you're leaving. I'm leaving, Maya confirmed. I'm going to transition to civilian helicopter operations, medevac flights mostly, search and rescue for maritime incidents. It's flying without the combat complications, and it means I can actually be present in a life with you, instead of constantly being somewhere else. Dev reached over and took her hand. That's a massive change. It is, Maya agreed. But so is everything else about this. So is loving someone who understands the specific kind of broken that comes from the work we do. So is choosing to build something with someone instead of building a career in the space where actual human connection isn't possible. They sat with that for a while, watching the last of the sunset fade. Below them, the cafe was closing for the evening. Maya could see the owner, an older woman named Patricia, locking up the front door. In a few days, Maya would start working there again, not full-time, but enough to maintain connection to the place where her life had transformed. I've been thinking about something, about what we do next, about how we rebuild lives that have been fundamentally altered by trauma and then by each other. And I think we need to stop approaching this like we're still in crisis mode. We're not recovering from the deployment anymore. We're not processing Cedar Ridge. We're in the actual aftermath, the part where we have to figure out who we are when we're not in survival mode. Maya understood what he was saying. In the past weeks, they'd fallen into a pattern of managing trauma together, comparing nightmares, processing memories, holding each other through difficult moments, which was necessary and important. But it meant they hadn't actually built anything new. They'd just been surviving the wreckage of what had been. "So what do you suggest?" she asked. "I suggest we go on an actual date," Dev said, and there was something almost playful in his tone. Like people who aren't military and aren't broken and aren't processing collective trauma. I suggest we take a weekend and drive up the coast and eat terrible seafood and not talk about Cedar Ridge or the deployment or any of the things that have been defining us. Maya felt something ease in her chest. That's terrifying. Why? Because if we're not trauma bonded, I don't know what holds us together, Maya admitted. What if you realize that you don't actually love me, that you just love the version of me that exists in crisis? That could happen, Dev said seriously. I'm not going to promise you certainty, because certainty doesn't exist in relationships any more than it exists in military operations. But I can tell you that I've loved you in crisis, and I want to discover who you are outside of it. And I'm willing to risk that you might discover you don't love me outside of crisis, because that's what actual love requires, the willingness to be chosen for reasons beyond survival. They did go up the coast. They spent a weekend in a small coastal town where no one knew them and no one cared about their history. They walked on beaches and ate overpriced fish and had conversations about things that had nothing to do with trauma, about books and music and the kind of small dreams that you couldn't build during wartime. And Maya discovered something remarkable. She liked him. Not just loved him in the way that comes from shared catastrophe, but liked him, enjoyed his company, found him funny in ways that had nothing to do with dark military humor, felt safe with him in ways that had nothing to do with having a mutual understanding of danger. When they returned home, Maya was different. The nightmares didn't disappear. That wasn't how trauma worked, but they were no longer the dominant feature of her internal landscape. They were something she experienced, and then processed, and then moved forward from. She started working full-time at the cafe again. Dev took his desk position and discovered he was surprisingly competent at administrative work, that there was a kind of puzzle-solving satisfaction in resource allocation and strategic planning that didn't require him to be in constant crisis mode. They moved in together 3 months after returning from deployment. A small house near the marina, nothing fancy, but big enough for both. They established routines that had nothing to do with military protocol. Coffee on Sunday mornings, dinner every weeknight, and long conversations that ranged across everything from philosophy to their favorite films. One evening, 6 months after deployment, Dev said something. "I've had a letter from James Chen's fiancée." Maya felt her entire body go still. "She wanted to thank us," Dev continued, "for what we did during the deployment. Apparently, the rescue operations included helping locate survivors from the region where her brother was missing. And they found him. He's alive." Maya couldn't speak. She'd carried the weight of James Chen, the original James Chen from Cedar Ridge, for 3 years, had let it define her exit from the military, had let it poison her sense of her own competence. "We didn't save him," Dev said quietly. "We didn't save James. But we saved someone else's loved one. We participated in a rescue operation that actually had positive outcomes. That matters. Not as redemption, because nothing redeems what happened to James, but as evidence that even after we break, even after we fail, we can still do good." Maya understood what he was offering. Not absolution, she'd stopped looking for that, but recontextualization. The recognition that life wasn't about erasing failure. It was about continuing to show up, continuing to make good decisions in the wake of bad ones, continuing to let love make you stronger instead of just making you afraid. "I want to marry you," Maya said quietly. "Not because of James Chen or Cedar Ridge or the deployment, not because you helped me through trauma, but because in the morning I want to see your face and know that you're choosing to stay. And I want you to know the same about me." Dev was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a small box from his pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment, but I think moments aren't right or wrong. They're just moments. And this one, where we're sitting in our backyard and you're declaring that you want to build a life with me, this seems like the right moment." The ring was simple, silver with a small diamond, nothing that drew attention, just something that said, "I'm committed to the choice of you." "Yes," Maya said, before he could ask formally. "Absolutely yes." They sat together in the darkening evening, and Dev held her hand like he'd been holding it all along, carefully, respectfully, understanding that her trust had been earned through consistency and presence. The cafe still operated below them. Sometimes Maya would work a morning shift and then go home to Dev, who would be reviewing tactical briefings for his new position as Strategic Operations Coordinator. It wasn't the life either of them had planned when they were younger and less broken. It was better than